A white neighbor calls the police on a black family, only to discover they are local lawmakers. The moving truck rolled up quietly on a Monday morning, catching only a few curious glances from the sleepy neighborhood. On Maple Street, where residents prided themselves on maintaining picture-perfect lawns and trimmed hedges, newcomers didn't go unnoticed. As the Thompsons, a family of four, began unloading boxes, a few neighbors watched from behind their curtains, peering out to observe the latest addition to their close-knit community. Among the observers was Mrs. Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher who'd lived on Maple Street for nearly 40 years. She was proud of her neighborhood's old-fashioned charm and believed every new family needed to respect its traditions. Something about the Thompsons unsettled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. "They're probably just keeping to themselves," she muttered, though the sight of the family's car, slightly older and dustier than those usually parked on Maple Street, raised her suspicions. She noted the way the parents, Marcus and Lisa Thompson, moved purposefully but quietly, instructing their teenage children as they unloaded boxes and settled in. Hours passed, and Mrs. Jenkins found herself observing more than usual, becoming fixated on any small, unusual detail she could find. She whispered to her friend Jean over the phone, voicing her worries. "They don't seem like our usual kind of folks," she said, her tone laced with concern. As night fell, the Thompsons gathered in their living room, still surrounded by unpacked boxes, unwinding from the day's work. Outside, Mrs. Jenkins felt an unshakable sense of unease that gnawed at her. By night's end, she had convinced herself that the new family on Maple Street might bring more than they bargained for. The following morning, Mrs. Jenkins rose early, her mind still lingering on the Thompsons. She looked out her window, hoping to catch a glimpse of them. Just as she began to turn away, she saw Mr. Thompson carrying in a box from their car. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed him glance around, as though checking his surroundings. She immediately reached for her phone. "I know it sounds silly, Jean," she whispered into the receiver, "but something feels off about them." Jean, her friend and neighbor, tried to reassure her. "They're probably just busy with the move," she replied, her tone calm. But Mrs. Jenkins couldn't let it go. Her mind whirled, and with each small observation, she grew more convinced that the Thompsons were hiding something. Later that afternoon, she noticed the family unpacking in the driveway again. Mrs. Jenkins strained to hear their conversations, though she could only catch bits and pieces from afar. The Thompsons' voices were warm, with laughter and chatter between the parents and their teenage children. But Mrs. Jenkins dismissed this as an act, something to lull the neighborhood into comfort. By evening, Mrs. Jenkins had convinced herself that the Thompsons might not be who they claimed to be. Their quietness seemed calculated, and she imagined that each box they brought in could be hiding something suspicious. Fueled by her own unease, she called the local police, describing her concerns as urgent. "There's a new family on Maple Street," she said. "I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but I'd feel better if you check them out. They don't look like they belong here." As she hung up, Mrs. Jenkins felt justified, convinced she was simply looking out for her neighborhood. Just as dusk began to settle over Maple Street, two police cruisers pulled up in front of the Thompsons' home. Red and blue lights illuminated the street, casting a flashing glow across the quiet neighborhood. Neighbors peeked out from their windows, curious and concerned, wondering what had brought the officers to their doorstep. Inside, the Thompsons had just started to relax after another day of unpacking. The loud knock on the door startled them, and Mr. Thompson stood up, exchanging a quick look with his wife before heading to the door. He opened it to find two officers standing on their porch, their faces a mix of politeness and professionalism. "Good evening, sir," one of the officers said. "We received a call about some concerns in the neighborhood. Do you mind if we ask a few questions?" Confused but calm, Mr. Thompson nodded. "Of course. Is something wrong?" The officer explained that a neighbor had reported suspicious behavior, hinting at potential danger. Mr. Thompson's expression shifted from confusion to a controlled frustration as he processed what was happening. Lisa joined him at the door, and the two of them patiently answered the officer's questions, explaining that they'd just moved in and were in the middle of settling down. Behind them, their teenage children watched with wide eyes, sensing the tension but staying silent. The officers, realizing quickly that the call had been unfounded, apologized for the disruption. As they returned to their cars, Mrs. Jenkins, watching from her window, felt a twist of satisfaction. To her, the police presence had confirmed her concerns, though others in the neighborhood began questioning her judgment. As the cruisers drove away, the Thompsons looked at each other, their initial shock giving way to a determination to face whatever came next. The next morning, Mr. Thompson decided to address the situation directly. He'd noticed Mrs. Jenkins watching from her window the night before and sensed she was behind the police call. With a calm resolve, he walked across the street, his steps confident, hoping to dispel any tension with a conversation. Mrs. Jenkins was watering her begonias when she saw him approach. Her spine straightened, eyes narrowing as he neared her lawn. She forced a polite smile, though her unease was evident. "Good morning, Mrs. Jenkins," Mr. Thompson began, offering a warm smile. "I thought it would be good to introduce ourselves properly. I'm Marcus Thompson, and my wife Lisa, and I just moved in with our kids." Mrs. Jenkins nodded stiffly, clearly taken aback by his directness. "Well, welcome to Maple Street," she replied, glancing toward her flower bed. "I didn't mean to cause a fuss. It's just, well, we don't usually have unexpected newcomers." Marcus noticed her hesitation and chose his words carefully. "I understand. New faces can sometimes feel like a disruption to a neighborhood's routine. But I assure you, we're just here to build a life like everyone else. Lisa and I are both lawmakers at the state level, so our schedules can be hectic, but we're excited to make Maple Street home." Her mouth dropped slightly at the revelation, and she blinked, momentarily stunned. "Oh, lawmakers, you say?" "Yes," he nodded. "We work in public service. I hope we can build a positive relationship here." Mrs. Jenkins mumbled something about being glad to have upstanding neighbors, clearly thrown by this unexpected detail. As Marcus walked back home, Mrs. Jenkins' mind raced. She'd wanted them investigated, yet they turned out to be the very people she'd voted for. The encounter left her conflicted, but her pride kept her from admitting fault. Word of the incident spread like wildfire across Maple Street. By midday, nearly everyone had heard about the police visit to the Thompsons' house and the revelation that they were lawmakers. A few neighbors were appalled that anyone would make such a call based on assumptions, while others were quietly intrigued by Mrs. Jenkins' actions, albeit slightly embarrassed on her behalf. Over coffee, neighbors murmured about what had happened. The Thompsons became a topic of intense discussion, their background as lawmakers fueling admiration in some and resentment in others. Some questioned whether Mrs. Jenkins had overreacted, while others defended her, saying that it was natural to be cautious about strangers. "I don't see what the fuss is," said Jean, Mrs. Jenkins' closest friend, as she discussed the event with a few other neighbors on a porch nearby. "Maybe it was a bit hasty, but Maple Street has always been a place where we look out for each other." "But calling the police on the first day?" Another neighbor chimed in, shaking her head. "It's just, well, it's embarrassing for the rest of us." Meanwhile, back at their home, the Thompsons were shaken but remained resolved. Lisa and Marcus discussed how to proceed, knowing they were under scrutiny. They had faced worse challenges in their careers, but this was different. This was their home. "We knew this could be difficult, but I didn't expect it on the first day," Lisa sighed, glancing out the window where Mrs. Jenkins' house sat in clear view. Despite the gossip and wary stares, the Thompsons decided to stay focused on settling in, hoping the whispers would eventually die down. But Mrs. Jenkins, meanwhile, felt more isolated than ever, watching as her neighborhood began to doubt her judgment. A few days later, the neighborhood association held its monthly meeting in the community center. The Thompsons decided to attend, hoping to introduce themselves formally and dispel any lingering doubts. They arrived a few minutes early, greeting neighbors with warm smiles as they took their seats near the front. Mrs. Jenkins noticed them immediately. She felt a strange sense of unease, uncertain of how they would address the elephant in the room. Other neighbors, curious and perhaps a bit guilty, also glanced their way, stealing quick looks at the family they'd been gossiping about. The meeting began with routine matters: upcoming events, neighborhood security, and community beautification. When it was time for introductions, Mr. Thompson raised his hand, and the room fell silent. He stood, offering a confident smile to the gathering of watchful eyes. "Hello, everyone," he began, voice calm and assured. I'm Marcus Thompson, and this is my wife, Lisa, and our 2 children. We're excited to join the Maple Street community, and we look forward to getting to know each of you better." There was a murmur of polite greetings and nods. He continued, "For those who may not know, both Lisa and I work as state lawmakers. We've dedicated our careers to public service, and while our schedules are often busy, we're committed to being involved here too." Mrs. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her cheeks tinged with red as he spoke. His calm, professional tone caught everyone's attention, and the neighbors seemed visibly impressed. The meeting continued with more interest in the Thompsons and their backgrounds, easing some of the earlier discomfort. By the end, there was a noticeable shift in the room. The Thompsons had presented themselves as both approachable and dedicated, leaving a lingering sense of admiration. But for Mrs. Jenkins, the encounter only deepened her internal conflict. As the days went by, Mrs. Jenkins found herself increasingly isolated. The neighbors she once chatted with regularly had started to avoid her, greeting her with strained smiles or quick nods before hurrying away. She noticed how they lingered near the Thompsons' home, exchanging warm words and friendly waves, while she felt like an outsider in her own neighborhood. Her closest friend, Jean, gently confronted her over coffee one morning. "You know, Evelyn," she began, choosing her words carefully, "maybe the call wasn't the best idea. People are saying it came off, well, a little unnecessary." Mrs. Jenkins bristled, crossing her arms defensively. "I was just trying to protect us," she replied, her tone sharp. "Can you blame me for being cautious? We hardly knew a thing about them." Jean sighed, sensing the defensiveness in her friend's voice. "Maybe you could just talk to them. Explain yourself. It might help you feel better," she suggested gently. But Mrs. Jenkins refused, unwilling to apologize for what she still believed was a reasonable action. However, as she walked back to her house, her mind whirled with conflicting emotions. She knew that her actions had created tension, yet a part of her was too proud to admit fault. The Thompsons' friendliness and openness only intensified her discomfort. They hadn't given her any reason to suspect them, yet she had acted out of fear and assumptions. As night fell, Mrs. Jenkins found herself lying awake, replaying her actions in her mind. For the first time, she questioned whether her quick judgments were the problem. But with the entire neighborhood now looking at her with disapproval, she wondered if it was too late to make things right. In an attempt to ease the tension, Lisa Thompson decided to organize a neighborhood picnic, hoping it would provide a chance for everyone to relax and get to know each other better. She printed invitations and slipped one into every mailbox on Maple Street, including Mrs. Jenkins, with a note saying they hoped everyone would attend. On the day of the picnic, Lisa and Marcus set up tables with food, drinks, and lawn games. They chatted with early arrivals, who seemed more than willing to welcome them and enjoy the festivities. Kids played in the yard, and the Thompsons mingled easily with their new neighbors, making a positive impression. Mrs. Jenkins lingered on her porch, watching as more people gathered at the Thompsons' house. She felt torn. Her pride told her to stay away, but a sense of curiosity, and perhaps guilt, nudged her toward joining. After much internal debate, she finally picked up a batch of brownies she'd baked and made her way across the street, hoping her gesture would go over well. When she arrived, Lisa greeted her warmly, acting as though there hadn't been any tension at all. "Mrs. Jenkins, we're so glad you came," she said, accepting the brownies with a grateful smile. The kindness in her voice was unexpected, leaving Mrs. Jenkins momentarily speechless. As the picnic continued, Mrs. Jenkins found herself engaged in small talk with Lisa and Marcus, surprised at how comfortable they made her feel. They were open and kind, asking about her years on Maple Street and her favorite places in the city. By the end of the picnic, Mrs. Jenkins felt a sliver of regret melting her earlier pride. She left with a lighter heart, realizing that the Thompsons were simply good people trying to make a home, just like anyone else. A few days after the picnic, Mrs. Jenkins found herself in an unexpected situation. Lisa Thompson knocked on her door, carrying a small plant as a thank you for the brownies she'd brought. Surprised but polite, Mrs. Jenkins invited her in, and they sat down in the living room for tea. After some small talk, Lisa gently broached the subject that had been lingering between them. Mrs. Jenkins, I wanted to talk about the night the police came by. She began, her voice calm but direct. I understand that you may have had concerns about us moving in. Mrs. Jenkins tensed, her fingers tightening around her teacup. She hadn't expected such a direct approach. It wasn't personal, dear, she replied carefully. It's just, well, we're used to things being a certain way here on Maple Street. Lisa nodded, understanding but not backing down. I get that change can be uncomfortable, she said. But it hurt us to feel like we were being judged before we'd even had the chance to meet everyone. We want to be part of this community, just like anyone else. The honesty in Lisa's words stirred something in Mrs. Jenkins. She hesitated, finally admitting, I suppose I may have jumped to conclusions. It wasn't right, and I see that now. Her voice was soft, almost vulnerable, as she finally acknowledged the impact of her actions. Lisa placed a hand on hers, offering reassurance. We appreciate your honesty, and we're here to move forward together. We'd like to make Maple Street a place where everyone feels welcome. As Lisa left, Mrs. Jenkins felt a strange mix of shame and relief. The conversation left her reflecting deeply on her actions, realizing the importance of open-hearted acceptance in her community. That evening, Mrs. Jenkins sat alone, her thoughts heavy after her conversation with Lisa. She found herself revisiting moments from her own past, memories she had long buried. Growing up, her parents had instilled certain ideas about safety and familiarity, notions that often came with an unspoken distrust of those who looked different or came from outside their small town. As a young girl, she remembered watching her mother lock the doors when strangers walked by or crossed the street if someone unfamiliar appeared. Over time, these actions had embedded themselves in her worldview. Her parents had never outright told her to fear others, but their actions spoke louder than words. Mrs. Jenkins realized that the assumptions she'd held about the Thompsons were echoes of an upbringing filled with quiet biases and unspoken prejudices. She felt a pang of guilt as she thought about her own children and grandchildren, who had grown up in a far more diverse world. They had often challenged her views, encouraging her to see the world more openly. She'd resisted, feeling it was unnecessary to question beliefs that had felt natural for so long. Now, with the reality of the Thompsons' kindness and warmth, she saw clearly how her past had colored her present actions. The police call, the whispers, and the avoidance, all of it stemmed from deeply ingrained fears she hadn't even realized were there. Mrs. Jenkins sat with the weight of her realizations, understanding now that change was overdue. She resolved to confront her biases, hoping it wasn't too late to become a person who embraced difference rather than feared it. The next morning, Mrs. Jenkins took a deep breath, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers as she approached the Thompsons' door. She knocked gently, and when Lisa opened it, her face softened with surprise, then warmth. Mrs. Jenkins, it's nice to see you. Lisa greeted her, inviting her in. They sat together in the living room, and after a moment of silence, Mrs. Jenkins gathered her courage. I owe you and your family an apology, Lisa, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I made assumptions about you, assumptions that were unfair and hurtful. I let my fears get the better of me. Lisa listened, her expression patient and understanding, as Mrs. Jenkins continued. I grew up with certain ideas that I never really questioned, and that's no excuse. I'm truly sorry for the way I acted. You and your family deserve to feel welcomed here, not judged. Lisa placed a reassuring hand on Mrs. Jenkins' shoulder. Thank you for saying that, Evelyn, she replied, using her first name for the first time. It means a lot to hear this. Moving somewhere new is never easy, and we just want to be part of the community. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. I'd like to make it up to you if you'll let me. I want to be a better neighbor and a better friend. The two women shared a small smile, a silent understanding forming between them. Their conversation flowed naturally after that, touching on stories about family, life on Maple Street, and shared experiences. By the time Mrs. Jenkins left, she felt lighter, as though a wall had been broken down. For the first time, she saw the Thompsons as they truly were, kind, open-hearted people wanting the same sense of belonging as everyone else. As the weeks passed, the Thompsons' presence began to subtly transform Maple Street. They started attending neighborhood association meetings more regularly, bringing fresh ideas and perspectives to the table. They organized community discussions around diversity and inclusivity, encouraging open, honest conversations among the neighbors. At first, there was resistance. A few neighbors, hesitant to confront their own biases, avoided these discussions. But the Thompsons' genuine approach and willingness to listen drew people in. Their goal wasn't a lecture, but to create a space where people could share, learn, and grow. Gradually, the neighborhood started embracing the change. During one of these meetings, Marcus shared a story about his time as a lawmaker. "One of the most challenging parts of my job," he explained, "is helping people understand perspectives they might never have considered. I've found that simply listening can bridge divides we didn't even know were there." Mrs. Jenkins, sitting near the front, nodded thoughtfully. She'd attended every discussion since her apology to the Thompsons, feeling a renewed sense of purpose in understanding her neighbors on a deeper level. She even contributed stories of her own, sharing moments when her assumptions had clouded her judgment. The Thompsons' efforts soon led to practical changes. The neighborhood association began including workshops on cultural understanding, and families organized events to celebrate various traditions and backgrounds. Maple Street had become a place where differences weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. The transformation hadn't been easy, but the Thompsons had shown the community the value of unity and acceptance. Through small steps and open hearts, the neighborhood found itself growing closer than ever before. And for Mrs. Jenkins, the changes felt deeply personal. She felt proud of how far they'd come, even as she knew there was still more to learn. Mrs. Jenkins could hardly recognize herself in the mirror some days. The woman who had once called the police on her new neighbors now found herself actively involved in the Thompsons' community initiatives, eager to contribute to the dialogue around inclusivity and openness. She'd gone from feeling isolated to a new sense of purpose, determined to be part of the change. One Saturday, the Thompsons held a neighborhood potluck, inviting everyone to bring a dish that represented their family's heritage. Mrs. Jenkins, usually a creature of habit who clung to her traditional recipes, surprised herself by bringing a dish she'd never made before, a recipe from her great-grandmother that reflected her own family's immigrant roots. She smiled as she placed it on the table, noticing that her neighbors did the same, filling the table with diverse and colorful dishes from all backgrounds. As the event went on, Mrs. Jenkins felt a newfound connection with her neighbors. She struck up conversations with people she'd once considered strangers, asking about the stories behind their dishes and learning about family traditions from around the world. She felt alive with curiosity and a genuine desire to understand the people around her in a way she never had before. By the end of the evening, Mrs. Jenkins found herself sitting with Lisa and Marcus, laughing and sharing stories as though they'd been friends for years. She marveled at how her heart had softened, and how the Thompsons had welcomed her into this new world of community and connection without a hint of resentment. The change hadn't come easily, but it had come naturally, as her fears gave way to understanding. In opening herself to new experiences, Mrs. Jenkins had discovered a version of herself she hadn't known was possible, a version willing to grow, change, and embrace the beauty of diversity. With time, Maple Street transformed into a beacon of unity. Inspired by the Thompsons' efforts and Mrs. Jenkins' personal growth, the neighborhood organized events that celebrated the diversity they now embraced wholeheartedly. Families who'd once kept to themselves began mingling freely, learning about one another's backgrounds and sharing their own stories in return. The Thompsons proposed an annual neighborhood festival celebrating different cultures, with booths, music, food, and activities representing various traditions. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and neighbors jumped in to help organize. Mrs. Jenkins took charge of one booth, researching the heritage behind her own family's traditions and embracing this project as a testament to her journey. On the day of the festival, Maple Street was transformed. Brightly colored tents lined the street, each representing a different culture or tradition. Neighbors showcased foods from all over the world, and children darted between booths, laughing and playing games they'd never encountered before. Music filled the air, adding to the lively atmosphere as families shared dances, songs, and stories from their own backgrounds. At the heart of it all, the Thompsons mingled with ease, chatting with families and making everyone feel at home. Lisa caught sight of Mrs. Jenkins at her booth, sharing stories with a group of curious children, her face glowing with pride. It was a moment of realization for Lisa. The neighborhood had come so far, and in many ways, it was Mrs. Jenkins' transformation that embodied the spirit of their progress. As the festival continued, neighbors reflected on how different things had once been on Maple Street. The festival wasn't just a celebration of cultures. It was a celebration of growth, understanding, and the bonds they'd built together. The sense of community was stronger than ever, and each neighbor left that evening with a renewed appreciation for the people around them. The success of the festival left a lasting impact on Maple Street, and the neighborhood's newfound harmony became the talk of the town. Families that once kept their distance were now exchanging recipes, planning gatherings, and offering helping hands in times of need. The Thompsons had achieved what they'd set out to do. They'd created a neighborhood that truly felt like home. A few weeks after the festival, Mrs. Jenkins invited the Thompsons over for tea. It was a quiet afternoon, and the garden was in full bloom. As they sipped their tea, she thanked them for their patience and their courage. "You've helped me see the world differently, and I'll always be grateful for that," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Lisa and Marcus exchanged a warm look, and Marcus replied, "We didn't do it alone, Evelyn. You were willing to open your heart. That's what made all the difference." From that day forward, Mrs. Jenkins became one of the Thompsons' closest friends, often dropping by to chat, help with community events, or simply enjoy their company. She had found a new purpose in promoting unity and acceptance, encouraging other neighbors to join her in building a welcoming community. In the months that followed, Maple Street continued to thrive as a diverse and inclusive neighborhood. They planned another festival for the following year, one that they hoped would become a lasting tradition. Mrs. Jenkins took a lead role in organizing, using her newfound knowledge and experience to bridge gaps and bring people together. On Maple Street, where divisions had once been sharp, a sense of shared purpose now brought neighbors together. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. And as the Thompsons looked around at their welcoming community, they knew they'd found more than a house. They'd found a family. The Thompsons and Mrs. Jenkins had taught each other invaluable lessons, and together, they'd woven a stronger, brighter tapestry of community. It was in every sense a new beginning. Thank you for watching our story about the Thompsons and the powerful lesson of understanding and community. We hope this story resonated with you and reminded you of the importance of empathy and open-mindedness in our neighborhoods. If you enjoyed the story, please give it a thumbs up, share it with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more meaningful stories. Your support helps us continue to bring these narratives to life. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next one.